They wore crowns, carried scepters, and called themselves chosen by God. But behind the golden glory, some English monarchs ruled with greed, cruelty, and paranoia that turned kingdoms into graveyards. These weren't just rulers, they were tyrants in robes, executioners in ermine. From child kings manipulated into mass violence to charming psychopaths who smiled as they signed death warrants. History remembers their victories, but it often forgets their victims. This is not a royal celebration. This is a descent into the darkest corridors of power. These are the 25 most evil kings and queens in English history. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more dark dives into history's untold corners. It helps us keep digging up the truths others leave buried. And hey, while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Texas? We want to know who else is wandering the halls of history with us tonight. 1. King John. History remembers King John not as a tyrant in shining armor, but as a petty, conniving man in a bad mood, perpetually. The kind of ruler whose evil didn't erupt in grand battles or fiery speeches, but leaked out in small, bitter drips. Starved nephews, squeezed barons, vanished treasures, and the kind of taxation that made grown men cry in Latin. He inherited the throne in 1199 after his more famous brother, Richard the Lionheart, died during yet another glorified tantrum in armor. John, by contrast, never had the charisma or the courage, but what he lacked in nobility, he made up for in sheer vindictive efficiency. Take the case of Arthur of Brittany, his own teenage nephew. Arthur had a better claim to the throne than John. That was a problem, but one easily fixed. Arthur was captured in 1202 and held in chains. By 1203, he had mysteriously disappeared. Rumors whispered of drunken nights and screams in the dark. Officially, no comment. Unofficially, even medieval chroniclers, not exactly known for subtlety, accused John of personally murdering the boy and tossing his body into the Seine. It's the kind of royal family drama Shakespeare would call a bit much. And then there was the starving, not of peasants, that was just standard policy, but of high-born prisoners. Matilda de Brioche, wife of a rebellious noble, was locked in a dungeon with her son and left to rot, starved, to death slowly. Their guards reportedly opened the cell weeks later to find Matilda dead, her son curled against her like a skeleton clinging to a ghost. All this because her husband insulted the king. That was John's style, petty revenge, the kind that could choke a kingdom. His rule wasn't a tyranny of grand conquest. It was one of spreadsheets, ransom lists and contracts soaked in blood and ink. His barons, extorted, fined, double-taxed. His people, sent to die in useless wars against France, all while their king lost more land in 5 years than his ancestors had gained in a century. Then there's the matter of the church. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, John insisted on appointing his own man. The Pope, not a fan of being told what to do by a monarch whose moral compass pointed south, responded by excommunicating him. John responded by seizing church lands and robbing monasteries blind. It took years of humiliation and a full-blown papal embargo to get him to grovel for forgiveness, which he did eventually in writing in public and with all the sincerity of a man writing an apology letter to avoid eternal damnation. By 1215, his barons had had enough. They cornered him and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that would later be hailed as the first step toward democracy, though at the time it was more like a ceasefire. John never intended to honor it. Within weeks, he tore it up, plunging England into civil war. He burned farms, looted cities, and hired foreign mercenaries to kill his own people. It's fitting that his death was as ignoble as his life. Running from rebels, he lost the crown jewels in a swamp, literally dropped them in a bog and couldn't get them back. He died soon after, sick and possibly poisoned, in a monastery, eating too many peaches. Even his death was greedy, and yet John left behind something accidentally enduring. His cruelty was so vast, so shameless, that it united his enemies in a way few kings ever managed. The Magna Carta survived him, his legend did not. But cruelty doesn't vanish, it mutates, evolves, and just as John weaponized starvation, the next tyrant in our blood-stained royal chain would turn cruelty into doctrine. This time with the full weight of religion, bureaucracy, and marital decapitation behind it. Because then came Henry VIII, a man who didn't just betray his wives. He invented entirely new ways to do it. 2. Henry VIII. There are kings who ruled with divine authority, and there are kings who ruled as if they were divine authority. Henry VIII chose the latter, loudly, violently, and with enough ego to fill a cathedral. When he ascended the throne in 1509, England sighed with relief. The last century had been one long hangover of civil wars, dynastic paranoia, and suspicious disappearances. Here was a handsome, athletic, educated prince, a Renaissance golden boy who could joust, sing, and quote theology between bites of roast pheasant. England didn't yet realize that behind the charm was a man who would turn the kingdom into a personal experiment in obedience. Henry's reign was not about stability, it was about appetite. Appetite for food, for power, for control, and yes, for wives. But that's the surface story, the tabloid history. The deeper truth was less about romance and more about empire. Every marriage, annulment, and execution was an act of political engineering. He wasn't just replacing queens, he was rearranging the moral architecture of England. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him loyalty and one surviving daughter, Mary. But Henry wanted a son, and nature, as always, refused to take royal orders. When the Pope declined to annul the marriage, Henry responded with the subtlety of a cannonball by creating a new church that answered only to him. Thus, the Church of England was born, not from faith but from spite. Monks, priests, and nuns who resisted found their monasteries dissolved and their lands seized. Henry justified it as reform. In practice, it was mass looting dressed in theology. The proceeds filled his treasury, his wars, and his palaces. Sacred objects melted into coin. Libraries vanished. The bones of saints were thrown aside for the price of lead. England became rich and morally bankrupt at the same time. And then came Anne Boleyn, the spark of his religious revolution. Henry promised her the world, or at least a world without Catherine. When she failed to deliver a son, he reversed his devotion as efficiently as he once professed it. Her fall was theatrical, trials, accusations, the careful rewriting of loyalty into treason. She became a headline for the ages, the queen who lost her head to satisfy a king's mood. But the pattern didn't stop. Jane Seymour died giving him the heir he wanted. Anne of Cleves was rejected for not meeting his aesthetic preferences. Catherine Howard was condemned for her indiscretions. Catherine Parr outlived him, though barely. Each wife reflected a stage in his moral corrosion, from romantic to paranoid, from passionate to monstrous. Meanwhile, England's religious landscape fractured. Catholics burned Protestants, Protestants burned Catholics, all in the name of a God who must have looked down in exhaustion. Henry's wars in France and Scotland drained fortunes and lives. His taxes bred resentment, and yet he saw it all as divine sanction. He truly believed God endorsed his every appetite. By his later years, he was swollen, suspicious, and surrounded by sycophants too afraid to disagree. He signed death warrants between banquets and prayed between executions. His final words were less about repentance and more about ritual, a man convinced he had done nothing wrong, only what destiny required. And destiny, it seems, had a dark sense of humour. His creation, the Church of England, would soon be hijacked by a daughter who took her father's religious fury and stripped it of mercy altogether. Because next came Mary Y., the child of Henry's obsession, raised on rejection, fire, and vengeance, a queen who believed she could burn her country clean. 2 monarchs down, 23 to go. And it's only getting darker from here. If you're still watching, you clearly have a taste for the twisted side of history. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button to keep the madness coming. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you somewhere warm, somewhere haunted, somewhere you're definitely supposed to be asleep? We're listening. 3. Bloody Mary. History has a habit of turning women into symbols. Queens, in particular, are not remembered as people. They are remembered as warnings, and few warnings burn brighter or bloodier than Mary was. Born to Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, Mary entered the world as her father's hope and left it as his legacy's curse. Her early years were a lesson in royal instability. One day, she was the treasured princess of a united kingdom. The next, she was declared illegitimate, her mother cast aside, her household stripped from her. Her father's lust for succession and his new church reduced her status from heir to inconvenience. From that point onward, Mary's faith, the old faith, the Catholic faith, became her fortress. By the time she claimed the throne in 1553, England was exhausted. The realm had been through decades of religious chaos, monasteries dissolved, priests executed, Bibles rewritten, and families split by faith. The country's spiritual map looked like shattered glass. Mary believed her mission was divine repair, to take the fractured pieces and rebuild what her father had broken. She was 37, unmarried, deeply devout, and already hardened by humiliation. She saw her reign not as an opportunity, but as a penance. To rule, she believed, was to suffer, and to make others suffer if they defied God's order. In her mind, mercy was not kindness, mercy was correction. At first, her people welcomed her. She was Henry's eldest, the legitimate heir by the old order. Crowds cheered her entry into London. Church bells rang for a Catholic queen once more. But it did not take long for celebration to turn to fear. Mary's first act of restoration was to reunite England with the Pope. Her second was to marry Philip of Spain, a foreign prince whose name sounded like a foreign rule. That union made her unpopular before it made her a wife. Then came the burnings, or rather the policy behind them. Parliament restored the old heresy laws, allowing the state to execute those who rejected Catholic doctrine. Mary did not invent this law. She simply enforced it with missionary precision. Bishops, reformers, and ordinary citizens were arrested for preaching or printing Protestant texts. Mary believed she was saving souls. The condemned believed they were dying for truth. The number of deaths, by later standards, was small, roughly 300 over 5 years. Yet it was enough to scar the national memory forever. Each name, each trial, became a story whispered by survivors. And though the Queen believed she was purifying England, she only cemented its resistance. The more she tried to restore unity, the more her realm divided. Her reign was short and relentlessly tragic. The marriage to Philip produced no heir. The phantom pregnancies, cruel illusions of hope, became the gossip of courts across Europe. The Spanish alliance dragged England into costly wars, and her health deteriorated as the weight of failure pressed down. When she died in 1558, she was only 42. She left no child, no peace, and no monument of glory, only a kingdom relieved to move on. But Mary's tragedy wasn't simply that she killed, it was that she believed she had to. In her eyes, she wasn't an executioner. She was a healer performing surgery on a diseased nation. Every sentence she signed, she thought, was a prescription. And yet the disease spread, fear, division, hatred. And waiting on the horizon was the next monarch who understood that same disease, but treated it with calculation instead of conviction. Where Mary had faith, Richard III would have cunning. Where Mary saw salvation, Richard saw survival. And survival, in his hands, meant that even family could be expendable. 4. Richard III. The story of Richard III is less a biography than a cold case. One of those tales where the blood isn't on the floor, but in the margins. By the time the crown touched his head, England had already learned to mistrust smiling men with royal ambition. Richard simply confirmed the suspicion. He was the 11th of 12 children, a spare among spares in the sprawling House of York. Short, thin, politically underestimated, and physically afflicted with a curved spine, at least according to Tudor propaganda, Richard was not born to be king. He was born to serve kings, and yet, one by one, his obstacles disappeared. Not by accident, not by miracle, but by Richard's talent for stepping into voids left by chaos, sometimes voids he helped create. He rose during the tail end of the Wars of the Roses, a period when the crown of England passed hands more frequently than a bad coin. When his brother Edward IV took the throne, Richard became a loyal enforcer. He led campaigns, punished rebellion, and governed the north with cold efficiency. For a time, he played the role of the faithful younger brother, the quiet one, the competent one, the one who didn't want more. And then Edward died, suddenly, conveniently, leaving two young sons, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, as heirs to a throne now held together with frayed ribbon. The older boy, Edward V, was 12 years old, which meant a regency, which meant someone would rule in his name. Richard stepped forward, not as a king, of course, just as Lord Protector, just until the boy was crowned, just long enough to ensure a smooth transition. He had the princes moved to the Tower of London, which at the time was not a prison but a royal residence. They were kept there under protection, and then they were not seen again. No trials, no official notices, no mourning, no explanations, just silence. Their disappearance haunts England to this day. The official narrative never arrived. Rumours took its place. Richard's own coronation occurred shortly after the boys vanished. He claimed the throne on the grounds that Edward IV's marriage was invalid, making the princes illegitimate, convenient, legalistic, and brutally effective. To some, Richard was merely doing what everyone else was doing during that era, surviving. But to others, he was a usurper cloaked in procedure, a man who spoke of law while making corpses vanish beneath the legal record. And while historians still debate whether he gave the order or whether someone else acted on his behalf, the crown ended up on Richard's head and the boys ended up missing. History did the math. His reign lasted only 2 years. But in that short time, Richard managed to both consolidate power and alienate allies. His enemies gathered under the banner of a relative nobody, Henry Tudor, a man with a flimsy claim but impeccable timing. In 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard was killed in combat. He was the last English king to die on a battlefield. It was a fittingly medieval end to a medieval career. After his death, the Tudors rewrote his story with venom and poetry. Shakespeare's Richard III became the textbook villain, a hunched sociopath cackling in the shadows. But even without theatrical flair, the facts are cold enough. A protector who became a king, 2 boys who vanished, a country that never quite forgot. And yet, the most chilling part of Richard's story isn't what he did, it's how easily he did it. There was no uprising, no civil panic, no mass resistance. The princes disappeared, and the nation shrugged. It was exhaustion disguised as apathy, the kind of silence that always follows too much violence. That silence would return, but louder, under the rule of a king who brought conquest not just to households or heirs, but entire nations. One who saw walls and thought siege, saw borders and thought invasion. Edward I, the man they called Longshanks, was coming, and he believed empires were built by removing everything that got in the way. 5. Edward I, Longshanks. If Richard III was the king who quietly erased enemies under the cover of law, Edward I was the king who did it out in the open, with banners raised, trumpets blaring, and the full weight of the state marching behind him. Subtlety was not his mode. He preferred iron. They called him Longshanks for a reason. He was tall by medieval standards and imposing in both stature and policy. He was also known as Hammer of the Scots, though that nickname wasn't earned for his diplomatic tact. Edward I didn't just rule England, he dragged it by the throat into the idea of conquest as a national virtue. Born in 1239, the son of Henry III, Edward learned early how fragile a crown could be. His father had faced rebellion, humiliation, and the slow erosion of royal power. Edward took notes. By the time he ascended the throne in 1272, he was already hardened by war, cunning in politics, and utterly convinced that kingship wasn't a blessing, it was a weapon. He started with Wales. England had long claimed theoretical supremacy over its western neighbour, but Edward turned theory into ruin. He waged a brutal campaign of conquest, building massive stone castles like Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech, not just as fortresses, but as monuments to dominance. The message was simple. Wales didn't need to be governed, it needed to be tamed, but his legacy in Wales was merely the prelude. The real tragedy unfolded further north, in Scotland, a kingdom Edward saw as vulnerable, divided, and ripe for administration. When the Scottish throne became vacant after the death of Alexander III, Edward offered to arbitrate. What he really did was manipulate, bully, and impose his overlordship. When the Scots resisted, he responded with the full fury of the English war machine. He ordered invasions, sacked cities, and installed puppet rulers. In 1296, his army captured and looted Berwick, one of Scotland's most prosperous towns at the time. What followed was a systematic campaign to crush resistance, not just militarily, but culturally. He removed the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, and had it placed under the English throne in Westminster. A symbolic theft, yes, but also an act of imperial humiliation. Figures like William Wallace rose in rebellion, only to be hunted and punished with theatrical cruelty. Edward treated resistance not as politics, but as treason, and treason deserved spectacle. His vision of empire didn't allow for compromise, only submission. And then there was 1290, the year he ordered the Edict of Expulsion, which banished every Jew from England. It was one of the earliest and most comprehensive acts of ethnic cleansing in European history. Centuries of Jewish life, merchants, scholars, families, were erased in a single royal decree. Why? Partly religious zeal, partly economic expediency, mostly political convenience. The Jewish community had long been scapegoated, taxed, and blamed for everything from famine to royal debt. Edward saw their removal not as a tragedy, but as administrative efficiency. The crown even profited from seized property and cancelled loans. By the end of his reign, in 1307, Edward had reshaped England into something harsher, more centralised, and far more dangerous. His reforms strengthened Parliament, his conquests expanded the crown's influence, and his brutal methods set precedents for monarchs who preferred fear to love. And yet, he died on the road, marching north once again, old and unwell, still trying to subdue Scotland. His bones were buried in Westminster Abbey beneath a Latin inscription, "Here is Edward, the hammer of the Scots. Keep faith." A man remembered not for justice, but for domination. 6. Henry II. If Henry II had been born in any other century, he might have been remembered as a brilliant administrator, a man who reorganized law, enforced royal authority, and stabilized a volatile realm with ruthless precision. But he was born in the 12th century, and in the 12th century, being efficient wasn't enough. You had to be feared, and Henry was very good at fear. He was the first of the Plantagenet kings, a dynasty known more for its internal combustions than its longevity. When he came to power in 1154, England had just stumbled out of a civil war so chaotic that people referred to it simply as the anarchy. Nobles had built private castles like parasites sprouting on the body of the realm. Laws were regional suggestions, and kingship was more of a theory than a functioning position. Henry II changed all that quickly, brutally. He reclaimed royal lands from barons with the calm efficiency of a tax collector. He demolished hundreds of unauthorized castles, re-established royal courts, standardized the justice system, and reasserted the king's authority in every corner of the country. But reform under Henry didn't mean fairness. It meant order, and order, as always, had a price. Despite his reformist image, Henry's rule was thick with paranoia. He saw threats everywhere, especially within his own family. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a political powerhouse in her own right. Their children were ambitious, manipulative, and deeply skilled at betrayal, largely because they learned it from their father. Henry spent much of his reign fighting wars against his own sons, whom he never fully trusted, which, to be fair, was mutual. But the defining event of Henry's reign, the moment where reform turned into something darker, came not from his court or his family, but from the church. Thomas Becket had been Henry's closest friend, drinking partner, and political ally. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry thought appointing Becket would give him control over the church. But power does strange things to people. Once Becket wore the robes of Archbishop, he transformed from courtly accomplice to devout defender of ecclesiastical independence. He opposed Henry's legal reforms, challenged royal interference, and quickly became a symbol of church defiance. What began as a political disagreement turned into a Cold War. Becket fled into exile. Henry stewed in rage. When Becket returned to England, the tension snapped during a particularly bitter evening. Likely over wine and wounded pride, Henry is said to have uttered the infamous words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights heard it as a royal command. Becket was killed inside Canterbury Cathedral at the altar. The act shocked Christendom. The idea that a king's word, even an offhand remark, could lead to the assassination of the head of the English church shattered whatever illusion remained about the balance of power. Henry claimed it wasn't what he meant, that it was a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. Publicly humiliated and politically cornered, Henry was forced to perform penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury while monks flogged him with rods. A king reduced to ritual shame, and still, even after that, he never truly softened. He kept his grip tight, ruling not through love or charisma, but through relentless control. In the end, his sons turned on him again. His empire fractured. His legacy burned into English governance, but not its heart. He died muttering curses against his children, abandoned by the very heirs he had raised to fight him. And yet, he left behind something dangerously enduring, a monarchy that believed it could shape even the church to its will. That belief would grow and twist in the hands of weaker sons and stronger swords. One of those sons, Edward II, would inherit the crown, but none of the discipline. Where Henry ruled with authority, Edward would rule with disaster. And this time, England would pay the price for its king's affections. 7. Edward II. Edward II was the kind of king who makes historians sigh, not out of pity, but exasperation. He wasn't a villain in the classical sense. He didn't set out to dismantle the monarchy or burn his way through Europe. But incompetence, when paired with power, can be just as devastating as malice. Edward proved this thoroughly, and then some. He came to the throne in 1307, following the death of his father, Edward I, a monarch known for conquest, control, and architectural tyranny. Edward II inherited all the machinery of a war-ready empire, and then he misplaced the manual. Where his father ruled with cold iron, Edward ruled with emotional improvisation. He preferred pageantry to policy, leisure to leadership, and, most damning of all, personal loyalty to public responsibility. He was charismatic, yes, approachable even, but in the eyes of the barons he was unserious, and the barons of medieval England were not a forgiving audience. The heart of the crisis was Edward's reliance on Piers Gaveston, a nobleman of moderate birth who somehow found himself in possession of royal favour, lavish titles, and unparalleled access to the king. To Edward, Gaveston was a companion, an advisor, and perhaps the only person he trusted. To everyone else, he was a walking insult. He mocked the nobility, flaunted his privileges, and carried himself like a man who had already read the ending of the story and knew he wouldn't be punished. The English nobility responded in the only way they knew how, by writing angry documents and quietly assembling armies. They forced Edward to exile Gaveston. He brought him back. They forced him out again. He returned again. Eventually, the barons gave up on diplomacy and took action. Gaveston was captured and executed without a trial in 1312. It wasn't legal, it wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Rather than restoring order, Gaveston's death deepened the king's paranoia and solidified his distrust of the nobility. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger, the next royal favourite, who, unlike Gaveston, wielded his influence with calculated malice. The Despensers exploited the king's dependents to seize lands, crush rivals, and expand their power through fear and manipulation. This time, the backlash was broader and bloodier. Barons who had once tolerated Edward's eccentricities now rose in open rebellion. England descended into lawlessness in many regions, and the royal court became a bunker of denial. The Despensers clung to influence while the country came apart at the seams. Meanwhile, Edward's personal life unravelled in the background. His queen, Isabella of France, initially a diplomatic bride, grew increasingly estranged. Her political position was undermined by the Despensers. Her role at court diminished, her patience worn thin. In 1325, she left for France, ostensibly on a diplomatic mission. She did not return alone. In 1326, Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer invaded England with a modest army and massive public support. Edward, abandoned even by his closest men, fled. He was captured shortly thereafter, deposed by Parliament, a rare and humiliating end for a medieval monarch. His son, Edward III, was installed as a figurehead while Mortimer and Isabella held the reins of power. Edward II's fate after his abdication is still debated. Official accounts claimed he died in captivity the following year. Some rumours suggested escape, others whispered conspiracy. But what's certain is that Edward's reign set a new standard for royal collapse. He left behind no empire, no reform, no great war, only a fractured monarchy and a legacy defined by favouritism and failure. His downfall, however, gave rise to a new chapter, one fueled not by love or loyalty, but by ambition and strategy. Because his son, Edward III, would not repeat his father's mistakes. He would wage war not against his nobles, but against an entire continent, and keep it going for the rest of his life. 8. Edward III. If Edward II ruled like a man born into the wrong story, then Edward III ruled like a man determined to rewrite the script entirely. He was only 14 when his father was overthrown, and though the crown was placed on his head, the strings were still held by his mother, Isabella of France, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, the real power behind the throne. For 3 years, young Edward watched from the sidelines as his mother and her lover governed in his name, alienating allies and overreaching their authority. Then, in 1330, at the age of 17, Edward made his move. With a small band of loyalists, he captured Mortimer in the dead of night and had him tried and executed for treason. His mother was spared, placed under house arrest for the rest of her life, not as an act of mercy, but of image control. Edward had learned early that power was not something inherited. It had to be seized, and once he had it, he refused to let go. Edward III reigned for 50 years, one of the longest in English history, and he spent much of it in armour. He was a king obsessed with legacy, chivalry, and most of all, war. In 1337, he laid claim to the French crown through his mother's lineage, triggering the 100 Years' War, a conflict so protracted it outlived him by decades and left entire generations shaped by its devastation. But Edward wasn't content with political claims. He needed spectacle. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, his army, outnumbered and far from home, crushed the French using superior tactics and deadly longbows. It was a defining moment, not just militarily, but culturally. It transformed Edward into a symbol of English might and gave birth to a dangerous myth that England could and should dominate France. A year later, his son, Mars, the Black Prince, led the storming of Calais, a brutal siege that ended with Edward expelling the French population and repopulating the city with loyal English settlers. Calais would remain under English control for over 2 centuries, but its legacy was written in scorched walls and forced migration. Back home, Edward cultivated an image of ideal kingship. He revived the cult of King Arthur, founded the Order of the Garter, and turned Windsor Castle into a chivalric Disneyland. But beneath the glittering armor was a man whose obsession with war slowly drained the realm. Campaigns were expensive, and the victories came at the cost of relentless taxation, growing resentment, and rising instability. Then came the Black Death. In 1348, the plague reached England and tore through the population. Edward, ever the warrior, retreated from public view. Entire towns were wiped out, the economy collapsed, and labor became scarce. The king issued laws to freeze wages and prevent peasants from demanding better conditions. But the social order had shifted. Discontent began to simmer. By the later years of his reign, Edward's grip weakened, his once sharp political instincts dulled. His beloved wife, Philippa of Hainault, died. His eldest son, the Black Prince, fell ill. The king grew reclusive, and real power slipped into the hands of ambitious courtiers and his mistress, Alice Perrers, who became a symbol of corruption and decay. Edward died in 1377, old, sick, and politically isolated, a warrior king undone not by foreign swords, but by time and exhaustion. His wars had won battles, yes, but they also built the stage for national bankruptcy and political revolt. And the throne he left behind, it passed to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, a boy barely old enough to hold a scepter, let alone a nation spiraling into crisis. But before Richard could make his own mess, another Henry would step into history, one who combined charisma with cold calculation. Because Henry V wasn't interested in ruling a divided kingdom. He wanted to rule too, and he'd baptized that ambition in the mud of Agincourt. 9. Henry V. If kings were judged only by victories, Henry V would be a saint in armor. His face would be carved into stone, his name whispered with reverence, his legend unchallenged. And in fact, for many, it still is. He's the golden boy of English medievalism. Shakespeare's gallant prince turned heroic king, a man of courage, eloquence, and almost supernatural battlefield brilliance. But history, real history, does not award halos so easily. Behind the myth of Agincourt and the glory of conquest was a colder truth. Henry V was not a king of peace. He was a king of single-minded war, guided by a belief in divine purpose and national supremacy. And those two forces, when paired, rarely leave a clean trail. He came to power in 1413 at the age of 25, the son of Henry IV, who had seized the crown through usurpation and spent his reign fending off rebellion. Henry V, by contrast, came in swinging, determined to erase his father's instability with sheer competence and militarized nationalism. He began by crushing dissent at home. One of his first acts was to deal with the Lollards, a heretical religious movement advocating for church reform and vernacular scripture. Their leader, Sir John Oldcastle, once a friend of Henry's, was arrested and eventually executed. The message was clear: friendship ended where heresy began. But England for Henry was never going to be enough. His real ambition lay across the Channel. The claim to the French throne, long dormant, was revived with renewed intensity. In 1415, he invaded France, not as a raider, but as a king claiming what he believed was his by right and by blood. And then came Agincourt. The battle was lopsided on paper. Henry's forces were outnumbered, exhausted, and deep in enemy territory. The French knights outmatched him in armor, cavalry, and traditional prestige, but Henry had the longbow, and discipline, and an eerie calm under pressure. The French forces collapsed into a muddy catastrophe. Thousands were captured. Henry's men, fearing a renewed assault, executed many of the prisoners. an act that even in the brutal context of medieval warfare raised eyebrows. But Henry didn't flinch. To him, mercy was a liability. Efficiency was survival. In the years that followed, Henry returned to France again and again, each time with more troops, more victories, and more demands. By 1420, he forced the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited the Dauphin, the rightful heir, and named Henry the successor to the French crown. He also married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, sealing the deal in ink, blood, and royal bedding. It looked like destiny had spoken. England and France would be united under a single crown. Henry would be king of two nations. His son would inherit an empire. And then, just 2 years later, Henry died. He was 35, not in battle, not assassinated, but likely from disease during yet another siege. One moment he was leading armies, the next gone. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited the throne, and with it an impossible legacy, the crown of England, the claim to France, and a war machine with no off switch. Henry V's legend endured, but the empire he built was paper-thin, dependent entirely on his presence and willpower. Without him, the whole structure trembled, and with Henry VI, the tremble would turn into a collapse. Because while Henry V fought too hard, his son wouldn't fight at all, and in that silence, England would burn itself from within. 10. Henry VI. There are kings who lose battles, there are kings who lose kingdoms, and then there's Henry VI, a king who lost nearly everything and barely noticed. He came to the throne in 1422 at just 9 months old, a baby with a crown far too heavy for any grown man, let alone a child. His father, Henry V, had died at the peak of his power, leaving behind a country flush with victory and dangerously inflated expectations. England didn't just want a king, it wanted a second coming of its warrior saint. What it got was a fragile boy who grew into a fragile man, completely unfit for the storm he inherited. At first, it wasn't a disaster. England was governed by regents and war councils, men still drunk on the glory of Agincourt. The English crown, thanks to the Treaty of Troyes, claimed not only England but also France, an empire on paper, barely held together by swords and diplomacy. But as Henry grew older, it became clear that this was not a king with fire in his blood. He was gentle, kind even, a devout man who preferred prayer to politics and charity to conquest. In a monastery, he might have been admired. On a throne, surrounded by wolves, he was doomed. Where Henry V had inspired terror in enemies and loyalty in allies, Henry VI inspired confusion. He rarely made decisions, avoided conflict, and retreated from governance entirely when things became difficult, which in 15th century England was almost daily. The French, understandably, saw an opportunity. Led by figures like Joan of Arc and the resurgent Dauphin Charles, they began reclaiming lost territory. Bit by bit, the English holdings in France evaporated. Castles surrendered, towns defected. By the time Henry was an adult, the dream of an Anglo-French empire had become a delusion. And while the external war was crumbling, the internal one was just beginning. At home, Henry's court fractured into bitter factions. Chief among them was the rivalry between the powerful Duke of Somerset and Richard, Duke of York. Both men saw themselves as rightful guides to the throne, if not its outright successor. Henry, predictably, refused to choose a side, which only deepened the divide. His failure to lead turned every disagreement into a power struggle. Every absence became an invitation to chaos. Then came the mental collapse. In 1453, the king suffered a complete breakdown. He became unresponsive, incapable of speech, unable to recognize even his newborn son. For over a year, the government ground to a halt. Parliament declared Richard of York Lord Protector. It looked like a smooth transition until Henry unexpectedly recovered, or at least returned to a vague semblance of himself. The Protectorate dissolved, the factions regrouped, and civil war became inevitable. What followed were the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that tore England apart. Lancaster versus York, Red Rose versus White. Henry was the figurehead of the Lancastrian cause, but not its driver. He was, at best, a passenger. At worst, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. A weak king, manipulated by stronger wills, incapable of peace, yet unable to wage war. He was deposed in 1461 by Edward IV, son of the Duke of York. Briefly restored to the throne in 1470, Henry's second reign lasted less than a year. By 1471, Edward returned with force, crushed the Lancastrians at Tewkesbury, and reclaimed the crown. Henry VI died soon after, quietly, suspiciously, in the Tower of London. Official records suggest natural causes. Most historians suggest otherwise. In the end, Henry left behind no legacy of victories, no monuments of reform, no heirs with authority. What he left was a blueprint for collapse, of a kingdom that had once looked outward and now turned violently inward. And from the wreckage of that civil war rose a new king, Henry VII, who would end the conflict by marrying the enemy, silencing the nobles, and ruling with paranoia disguised as peace. 11. Henry VII. If Henry VI was the ghost of a kingdom undone, then Henry VII was the cold hand that closed the crypt. He didn't ride into power on a wave of glory. He crept into it, calculated, cautious, and more survivor than conqueror. He ended the Wars of the Roses not with a final fiery battle, but with something quieter and far more unsettling: silence. Born in exile, raised in uncertainty, and crowned in blood, Henry Tudor's path to the throne was anything but noble. His claim was shaky, through an illegitimate Lancastrian line made legitimate only by royal decree generations prior. But timing, not lineage, was on his side. The English people were exhausted. After decades of dynastic warfare, betrayal, and broken kings, they were ready to trade heritage for stability. He delivered it, just not the way they expected. When Henry defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, he didn't just win a crown. He terminated an era. No more open rebellion, no more noble armies in the countryside, no more flashy declarations of rival kings. From here on out, power would be quiet, controlled, watched. The Tudors would not govern through love or grandeur. They would govern through information. Henry's genius and his cruelty lay in how he used fear without theatrics. He wasn't known for dramatic executions or flamboyant punishments. Instead, he built a government that made rebellion logistically impossible. He established a ruthless financial bureaucracy called the Council Learned in the Law, which specialized in fines, bonds, and legal traps. Nobles who once raised armies now signed contracts that effectively turned them into well-dressed hostages. Opposition wasn't crushed on the battlefield. It was audited. He monitored landowners like a suspicious landlord, taxed the aristocracy until their wealth became conditional, and replaced loyalty with obedience. He created spy networks, paid informants, and placed regional governance in the hands of those too scared to defy him. Under Henry, England became less of a kingdom and more of a spreadsheet, precise, balanced, and unforgiving. Even his marriage was a political operation. By wedding Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, he united the warring houses of Lancaster and York, not out of love, but necessity. The red and white roses were stitched together into a Tudor emblem, and with it, the illusion of national healing. But make no mistake, Henry didn't forgive the Yorkists. He just neutralized them. He faced numerous threats. Impostors like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, both claiming to be lost Yorkist heirs. Henry crushed one and humiliated the other, not with rage, but with legal performance. Simnel was put to work in the royal kitchens. Warbeck was paraded and then imprisoned. When they were finally executed, it wasn't vengeance, it was scheduled maintenance. His foreign policy mirrored his domestic rule, cautious, transactional, and deeply strategic. Rather than launching expensive wars, Henry focused on treaties and marriages. He strengthened England's trade position and avoided the costly entanglements that had plagued his predecessors. He wasn't admired across Europe, but he was respected, or at least feared in a bureaucratic sense. By the time he died in 1509, Henry VII had turned England into something new, a centralized state with a monarchy that could outthink its enemies rather than outfight them. He wasn't beloved, he wasn't even particularly popular, but he was effective in the most unnerving sense of the word. He had killed rebellion not with fire, but with paperwork, but his carefully constructed system would not survive the man who came next, because Henry VIII, his son and successor, wasn't interested in balance sheets. He was interested in power, raw, theatrical, and absolute. Where Henry VII ruled with control, Henry VIII would rule with appetite, and the kingdom would bleed for it all over again. 12. Charles I, where Henry VII ruled by calculation and Henry VIII by appetite, Charles I ruled by divine entitlement, the dangerous conviction that kings were not just chosen by God, but accountable to no one else. If the Tudors understood power as a game of negotiation and spectacle, Charles saw it as a birthright, silent, absolute, and not up for discussion. He wasn't the kind of tyrant who screamed orders from the battlements. Charles's cruelty came not from theatrics, but from a quiet, unwavering belief that everyone else was simply wrong. Parliament, protesters, his own generals, even his people. He wore the crown like armour and wielded silence like a sword. Born in 1600 to James I, Charles ascended to the throne in 1625 with a stiff formality and an already troubled kingdom. He inherited a nation struggling with religious division, a testy parliament, and the growing sense that the monarchy's authority should come with at least a few questions. Charles, to put it mildly, was not interested in questions. He immediately clashed with Parliament over money, particularly funds for foreign wars he wanted to pursue but couldn't justify. Parliament refused. Charles dissolved them, then brought them back, then dissolved them again. This became a pattern until he finally dispensed with the nuisance altogether in 1629 and ruled for 11 years without Parliament, a period now famously known as the personal rule. During this time, Charles governed through royal decree and forced loans. He leaned heavily on archaic laws to extract money from his subjects, reviving long-forgotten taxes and stretching legal loopholes into national policy. This wasn't governance, it was a monarchy running on technicalities. But the real spark came, as it so often did in English history, from religion. Charles married a Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria of France, and began imposing Anglican religious practices across the realm, including in Scotland, where Presbyterian traditions ran deep. In 1637, he tried to force the Scots to use a new Book of Common Prayer. They responded not with theological essays, but with open rebellion. The bishops' wars that followed were costly, humiliating, and exposed just how fragile Charles's rule had become. Out of money and options, he was forced to recall Parliament in 1640. It did not go well. Instead of funding his war, Parliament aired grievances, launched investigations, and began dismantling the very structure of royal power. Charles, in turn, tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament in person, marching into the chamber with soldiers, only to find his targets had already fled. It was the last straw. England descended into civil war. On one side, the royalists, who believed in the king's divine right. On the other, the parliamentarians, who believed the king should answer to the people's representatives, or at least stop dissolving them every time they asked hard questions. The war was brutal, drawn out, and marked by shifting allegiances. But by 1647, Charles had lost. Captured, imprisoned, and still refusing to compromise, he was put on trial in 1649, not by foreign invaders, but by his own subjects. He refused to recognize the court's authority. The court sentenced him anyway, and so Charles I became the first English king to be publicly executed. A monarch who believed himself chosen by God was cut down by the will of his people, but the death of a king didn't bring peace, it brought something stranger. Because the man who followed Charles didn't wear a crown, he didn't sit on a throne, and yet, for a brief moment in English history, he ruled with more unchecked power than any monarch before him. His name was Oliver Cromwell, and he governed not as a king, but as a Lord Protector, in name only. 13. William the Conqueror. Before kings ruled England in castles, they invaded it in boats, and none did it more decisively or more destructively than William the Conqueror, the Norman Duke who arrived in 1066 not to claim land, but to rewrite an entire nation. He wasn't born English, he didn't speak English, and when he finally took the English crown, he made it painfully clear. England now belonged to the Normans, and anyone who disagreed could expect their disagreement to be buried along with their village. William began as the Duke of Normandy, an illegitimate child nicknamed William the Bastard, who clawed his way to respect with relentless ambition and a calculated brutality that would define his entire reign. When the English king Edward the Confessor died without an heir, William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. Unfortunately, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in England, had other plans and a crown to match. William crossed the Channel with an army of knights, archers, and the blessing of the Pope. What followed was the Battle of Hastings, one of the most famous clashes in English history. Harold was killed, whether by an arrow to the eye or a Norman blade depends on which source you believe, and William marched on London, claiming the crown as his prize. But conquest was just the beginning. Taking the throne didn't make William English, it made England Norman, and William intended to keep it that way. His first act wasn't to win hearts and minds, it was to dismantle them. Anglo-Saxon nobles were stripped of their lands, titles, and influence. Their estates were handed over to Norman barons, many of whom had followed William across the sea with nothing but promises of future wealth. These weren't gentle handovers. The English elite vanished, absorbed or destroyed, their power erased like chalk under Norman stone. But the real measure of William's rule wasn't in titles, it was in terror. After a series of rebellions in the north of England, William launched what chroniclers would later call the Harrying of the North. This wasn't a military campaign in the usual sense, it was deliberate devastation. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, livestock slaughtered. Survivors were left with nothing to eat as winter approached. Contemporary accounts speak of widespread starvation, entire regions turned into ghostlands. William's goal wasn't just to punish rebellion, it was to make rebellion impossible. The North never truly recovered. To solidify his rule, William ordered the creation of the Domesday Book, an exhaustive survey of every field, village and property in the kingdom. It was a remarkable administrative feat and a chilling one. Nothing escaped its gaze. Every plough, every pig, every acre was recorded. It wasn't just a census, it was control in ink. William ruled with a kind of impersonal severity. He wasn't known for charm, he wasn't beloved, but he was feared, and in his eyes that was enough. He centralized authority, built a network of stone castles that loomed over once autonomous regions and reshaped the English church under Norman influence. Even the architecture changed. When William died in 1087, after falling ill during yet another campaign in France, he left behind a kingdom profoundly altered. The Anglo-Saxon world had been dismantled piece by piece, replaced by a foreign elite, a new language of power, and a government that reached deeper into daily life than any before it. And yet, for all his control, William could not conquer time. His sons would fight over his inheritance, and his methods, so effective in war, would sow distrust and rebellion in peace. One of those sons, William Rufus, would take the throne next. He would rule with his father's cruelty, but none of his caution, and his end would be as mysterious as his rule was merciless. 14. Stephen of Blois. In a country where kings usually rose and fell through war, Stephen of Blois stands out as the monarch who took a functioning kingdom and turned it into a permanent question mark. His reign wasn't just chaotic, it was uncertain. No one knew who was really in charge. Not the barons, not the church, not even Stephen himself most of the time. For nearly 20 years, England teetered on the edge of collapse, not because of an enemy invasion or religious upheaval, but because one man sat on a throne that never truly belonged to him. Stephen's claim to the crown was based more on speed than legitimacy. When Henry I, his uncle, died in 1135, the succession had already been arranged. Henry's only surviving legitimate child, Empress Matilda, was supposed to inherit the throne. She had the bloodline, the oaths of loyalty, and the legal backing. What she didn't have was Stephen's head start. Within days of Henry's death, Stephen raced across the Channel from Normandy to London, secured the support of key nobles and clergy, and had himself crowned king before Matilda could act. It was a classic medieval power grab, executed with just enough charm and just enough bribes to make it stick temporarily. But the trouble was built in. From the moment Stephen placed the crown on his head, his reign was a ticking bomb. Matilda never renounced her claim, and neither did her supporters. What followed was not simply a civil war, it was an unravelling. Historians call this period the Anarchy, a polite term for nearly 2 decades of lawlessness, famine, and political whiplash. Castles changed hands like poker chips. Noble families built private armies. Villages were fortified like city-states. Taxes became suggestions, and the crown more of a symbol than a functioning office. Stephen was not without qualities. He was brave in battle and personally loyal to his friends, but loyalty in his hands was a liability. He rewarded incompetence, trusted the wrong advisers, and forgave traitors who should have been dealt with permanently. Every attempt he made to stabilize the realm seemed to backfire. Every rebellion he crushed gave birth to 2 more. And then there was Matilda. In 1139, she landed in England with forces provided by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, and the kingdom split clean down the middle. Her supporters seized swathes of territory, installed rival courts, and openly declared her the rightful ruler. At one point, she even captured Stephen himself and held him prisoner, an unthinkable moment in English royal history. But Matilda's strength as a military figure didn't translate to political popularity. Her arrogance alienated allies, and London revolted against her before she could be crowned. Stephen was eventually released in a prisoner exchange, and the war dragged on in an endless loop of stalemates, betrayals, and burning countryside. Neither side could win outright, but both sides could destroy. By the 1140s, England was exhausted. The nobility had grown accustomed to acting independently. The peasantry suffered through ruined harvests and constant violence. Banditry became a profession. The church, caught between competing royalists, began consolidating its own power as a third authority. It was less a nation and more a chessboard flipped halfway through the game. Eventually, a compromise emerged, not through victory, but attrition. Stephen retained the crown, but agreed to name Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, as his heir. When Stephen died in 1154, the throne passed peacefully for the first time in decades, but peace wasn't the same as healing. The scars of the anarchy ran deep. England had learned what happened when royal authority fractured, and it would overcorrect in the years to come. Because the boy who would become Henry II was not interested in sharing power. He had watched a kingdom descend into chaos, and he would make sure it never happened again, even if it meant ruling with an iron grip and a dagger's subtlety. 15. Richard IV, the Lionheart. Richard V is the king everyone claims to admire, but no one would actually want to be ruled by. His image, polished over centuries of legend, speaks of chivalry, courage, and cross-shaped banners fluttering in holy winds. The real Richard, a man who spent less than a year of his decade-long reign in England, drained its treasury dry, and treated the crown not as a duty, but as a coin purse for foreign glory. He became king in 1189, following the death of his father, Henry II, with whom he shared a complicated relationship best described as armed disagreement. Richard had already earned a reputation as a warrior, commanding troops against his father and even his brothers during various rebellions. He was brilliant in battle, ruthless when cornered, and entirely uninterested in diplomacy unless it involved siege engines. From the moment he was crowned, Richard had one objective: the Third Crusade, not to reform England, not to improve its justice system, not even to live in it. His eyes were fixed firmly on Jerusalem, and the Holy Land was his battleground of choice. To fund his crusade, Richard did what any financially desperate monarch would do. He sold everything that wasn't nailed down. Offices, lands, titles, favours, all went to the highest bidder. "I would sell London if I could find a buyer," he reportedly said. It might have been a joke. It might not have been. Richard departed for the East barely months after his coronation, leaving his kingdom in the hands of others. His appointed administrators, including William Longchamp, ruled in his absence, and not without controversy. England, under Richard's absentee leadership, was like a house locked from the outside, while smoke poured through the windows. Meanwhile, Richard was carving out his legend abroad. He fought with audacity and precision in the Holy Land, most famously against Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Their rivalry was a clash of icons: lion against eagle, west against east, myth against myth. Richard won battles, captured cities, and showed remarkable military skill, but he never reached Jerusalem, never took it, never even laid siege to it. Instead, he signed a truce, not a triumph, and began the long, expensive journey home. And then he was captured. While crossing Europe in disguise, badly, Richard was seized by Leopold of Austria, whom he had insulted during the Crusade. Richard was handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who demanded an astronomical ransom for his release: 150,000 marks, nearly 3 times England's annual revenue. To pay it, taxes were raised, the treasury drained, and the burden fell on a population that had hardly seen their king, but now had to buy him back. Monasteries melted their sacred relics. Nobles grumbled. The people paid. Richard finally returned to England in 1194 for a grand total of 6 months. He spent the rest of his reign fighting to reclaim his French territories, which had begun to slip away under the opportunistic eye of Philip II of France. Richard's battles there were bold and often victorious, but they were not for England. They were for the Angevin Empire, his patchwork inheritance stitched together by generations and constantly under threat. He died in 1199, not in glorious battle or royal ceremony, but during a minor siege at Charlus, shot by a crossbow bolt and succumbing to infection. His death, like much of his reign, took place far from the island he ruled in name. For many, Richard remains a romantic figure, the noble crusader, the king of adventure. But in practical terms, he was an absentee landlord with a crown, one who taxed his people to fund his obsessions and left the machinery of state to rust in his absence. And yet his legacy endured, not because of what he gave England, but because of what he symbolized: a lion-hearted myth in a time of mud and mortality. But the crown he left behind passed to a man very different from himself. Where Richard was bold, his brother John was bitter. Where Richard fought abroad, John fought everyone, including his own country. And unlike Richard, King John stuck around, unfortunately. 16. James. If Henry VIII shattered England's religious landscape and Elizabeth I lit it on fire, James I arrived expecting to rule over the ashes like a benevolent philosopher king. What he got instead was a kingdom drenched in suspicion, divided by dogma, and increasingly allergic to absolutism. James believed in divine right, the idea that kings were accountable only to God, but ruled a people increasingly convinced that kings should be accountable to someone. He came to the English throne in 1603, following the death of Elizabeth I, and brought with him a different crown, James VI of Scotland. For the first time, the thrones of England and Scotland were joined under a single monarch, but union did not mean harmony. England didn't fully trust their new king. He was Scottish. He He was foreign, and he was, according to some of the more poetic chroniclers, excessively fond of himself. Still, James had qualifications. He was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and a prolific writer, the only English king to publish a treatise on demonology and a political defense of absolute monarchy. He believed governance was an intellectual exercise, and he tried to rule with words before resorting to weapons. But in England, rhetoric only got you so far. His biggest mistake wasn't arrogance. It was underestimating the depth of religious paranoia in his new kingdom. England was still trembling from decades of Protestant-Catholic conflict. The Reformation had scarred the national psyche. Catholics were viewed not just as outsiders, but as potential traitors. James, a Protestant himself, initially struck a tone of moderation. He promised toleration and civility, and for a moment, Catholics hoped for a thaw in persecution. Then came the Gunpowder Plot. In 1605, a group of Catholic conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament while the king and much of the political elite were inside. It was audacious, terrifying, and ultimately a failure. The plot was discovered in time, the explosives never ignited, and the conspirators were arrested and executed. But the damage was done. Any hope of religious compromise vanished overnight. James responded with crackdowns, harsher laws, and a doubling down on state-sponsored Protestantism. Catholics were once again painted as enemies of the crown, and James's rule took a darker turn, from cautious optimism to controlled repression. And yet, James wasn't a tyrant in the traditional sense. He didn't relish violence. He wasn't impulsive, but he governed with a persistent sense that he knew best, and that Parliament's role was to agree with him politely. That worked better in theory than in practice. As he pushed for more centralized control, Parliament resisted. They refused to grant him the taxes he wanted. He found ways around them, selling titles, granting monopolies, and squeezing funds through legal loopholes. His reign saw the rise of a deeply unpopular court culture filled with favoritism and financial scandals. His personal favourites, such as Robert Carr and George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, wielded enormous influence, enriching themselves while alienating powerful nobles. James also tried and failed to arrange strategic royal marriages. His most infamous effort was the proposed marriage of his son Charles to a Spanish princess. This deeply angered the English public, who feared a return to Catholic influence. The negotiations collapsed, and James's foreign policy lost what little credibility it had. Despite his missteps, James's reign wasn't entirely disastrous. He sponsored the King James Bible, a literary and theological landmark that would shape English-speaking Christianity for centuries. He promoted peace with Spain and avoided costly wars, something that made him seem weak to his critics but prudent to his allies. But in the end, his legacy was more intellectual than inspirational. He left behind a kingdom simmering with tensions, religious divides unresolved, Parliament increasingly defiant, and his son Charles, his heir, deeply shaped by his father's belief in divine right, but none of his patience for compromise. When James died in 1625, the throne passed to Charles III, a king who would take his father's theories and push them to their breaking point, until Parliament pushed back with armies. But before that storm arrived, the English crown passed once more into the hands of a queen. One remembered not for literature or theology, but for quiet ruthlessness cloaked in grandeur. Elizabeth I had ruled before James, but her story, her iron hand in a velvet glove, had set the tone for everything that followed. And beneath her glittering legend was a streak of cold calculation that rivals the cruelest kings. 17. Elizabeth I. The image of Elizabeth I that endures is carefully curated. The Virgin Queen, the radiant ruler in white and gold, the woman who gave her heart to England and triumphed against all odds. She has been cast in portraits, films, poems and plays as both icon and saviour, the last great Tudor, the steady hand guiding England from religious strife into a golden age. And yet, Behind the legend is a ruler every bit as capable of quiet brutality as her father Henry VIII, and more politically ruthless than many of the kings who came before her. Elizabeth didn't need to rule by brute force. She ruled by absence, ambiguity, and execution. Just enough violence to terrify, never so much as to define. She came to the throne in 1558 after the death of her half-sister Mary I, who left behind a kingdom scorched by religious violence and torn by uncertainty. Elizabeth inherited a state with no clear spiritual identity, little international goodwill, and deep internal distrust. She was Protestant, but cautiously so. She was unmarried, deliberately. She was politically shrewd, to the point of cold-blooded pragmatism. She wasted no time restoring Protestantism as the state religion, reversing many of Mary's Catholic policies with measured steps. The Elizabethan religious settlement was less an act of conviction than a political compromise. Church services in English, royal supremacy reasserted, but some Catholic traditions quietly retained to keep the peace. Elizabeth didn't care for religious zeal, she cared for obedience, but her tolerance had limits. Public dissent was not welcome. Catholic priests were hunted, fined, and eventually executed under laws that criminalized their very presence. Recusants, those who refused to attend Church of England services, were heavily fined. The idea wasn't mass persecution, it was strategic pressure. Elizabeth didn't need to convert everyone, she just needed to make rebellion inconvenient. Which brings us to Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, and, depending on whom you asked, a legitimate heir to the English throne. Mary was Catholic, charismatic, and a magnet for conspiracy. After being forced to abdicate in Scotland, she fled to England expecting sanctuary. Elizabeth gave her a prison. For nearly 2 decades, Mary lived under house arrest, moved from castle to castle, while Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, built a web of informants that would have impressed any modern surveillance state. Eventually, Mary was implicated in the Babington Plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and install Mary as queen. The evidence was gathered, the trial staged, and the verdict inevitable. Elizabeth hesitated to sign the death warrant. She agonized over it, delayed it, blamed others, but she signed it all the same. Mary was executed in 1587, a decision Elizabeth later pretended had been taken out of her hands. A calculated display of royal grief followed. But the message was unmistakable. Elizabeth would not be replaced. Not by kin, not by religion, not by anyone. Externally, her reign saw England's emergence as a maritime power. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was less a total naval victory than a symbolic turning point, a Protestant queen facing down the might of Catholic Europe and surviving. It cemented Elizabeth's image as a national saviour. What it didn't show was the desperation behind the scenes. Underfunded ships, delayed payments, and commanders operating with improvised strategies. At home, Elizabeth's court was a masterclass in image control. Poets, playwrights, and painters were carefully encouraged to build her myth. She cultivated the idea of the eternal maiden queen, wedded only to her people. She wore layers of makeup, elaborate wigs, and gowns designed to project a supernatural aura. The reality behind the mask, aging, indecisive, sometimes paranoid, was kept carefully hidden. She never named an heir, perhaps out of fear that naming one would hasten her end or spark another round of dynastic war. Instead, she let ambiguity reign. Power in her hands meant keeping others uncertain. When she died in 1603, childless and alone, England mourned her with a reverence that had been carefully rehearsed for decades. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuarts. Elizabeth left behind a legacy of art, empire, and statecraft, but also a template for quiet authoritarianism, cloaked in splendor, and it would be inherited by men far less subtle. Because Henry I, long before Elizabeth's time, had already shown how violence and bureaucracy could be fused into something enduring, and terrifyingly efficient. 18. Henry. Mind, if kingship is a balancing act between charm and control, Henry I walked the tightrope with a ledger in one hand and a sword in the other. He wasn't the kind of monarch to win hearts, but he was the kind to take names, and teeth if necessary. The fourth son of William the Conqueror, Henry wasn't supposed to inherit anything substantial. He was given a modest annual allowance and little expectation. But like many underdogs in royal families, he learned quickly how to read a room and how to wait for it to fall apart. When his brother William Rufus died suddenly and under suspicious circumstances in a forest hunting accident in 1100, Henry didn't waste time mourning. He galloped to Winchester and seized the royal treasury before anyone could question the succession. Days later, he was crowned king. Whether he had anything to do with his brother's mysterious death remains one of the less spoken riddles of English history. But timing, as ever, is everything. Henry styled himself as a reformer, issuing a Charter of Liberties that promised to roll back the arbitrary abuses of his predecessor. It was a clever move. One part political theatre, one part calculated damage control. His coronation document, often forgotten, would go on to inspire Magna Carta more than a century later. But if people expected a gentler king, they would be disappointed. He earned the nickname Henry Beauclerc, Henry the Fine Scholar. But what he lacked in battlefield charisma, he made up for in administration. He centralized authority, expanded the use of royal justice, and built a government that could outlast its individual kings. He turned the treasury into an institution, not just a vault, and he introduced the exchequer, a system of accounting so advanced for its time that it resembled the foundation of modern finance. But while Henry's bureaucratic genius gave England a more efficient government, his personal rule was anything but benign. To start, he dealt with threats, real or perceived, using methods that were cold, deliberate, and designed to send a message. One such message was sent to Robert of Bellême, one of the most powerful barons in the land. Robert defied Henry once, only once. He was arrested, his land seized, and his influence eradicated. Other rebellious nobles suffered similar fates, often losing not just their estates, but their physical safety. Blinding, mutilation, and permanent imprisonment were not just punishments, they were deterrents. And then there was Robert Curthose, Henry's elder brother and rightful heir to the throne of Normandy. Henry defeated him in battle at Tinchebray in 1106, took him prisoner, and kept him locked up for nearly 30 years until his death. No fratricidal melodrama, just quiet clinical removal. Henry also played power politics through marriage. His union with Matilda of Scotland was designed to smooth over tensions between Norman rulers and their Anglo-Saxon subjects. It worked, in part, because Matilda had a strong royal lineage that bolstered Henry's legitimacy. But legitimacy did not protect against tragedy. Henry's only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster in 1120, along with many of the realm's young nobility. It was more than a personal loss. It was a succession crisis in the making. Henry had other children, more than 20 illegitimate ones in fact, but none of them could legally inherit the throne. His daughter, Empress Matilda, became his chosen heir, and he spent his final years forcing his nobles to swear oaths of loyalty to her. Those oaths meant nothing. When Henry died in 1135, after fittingly reportedly overeating lampreys against his physician's advice, England spiraled into civil war. The crown passed to Stephen of Blois, a nephew who ignored the succession plan entirely. The result was the anarchy, a decade-long national meltdown of rival factions, burning towns, and forgotten laws. Henry I left behind a more organized England, but also one profoundly vulnerable. His legacy was a paradox, a kingdom more centralized than ever, yet completely dependent on his presence to hold it together. His systems endured, but his dynasty did not, because the next kings didn't just inherit Henry's throne, they inherited his ghosts, and Edward IV, centuries later, would return to the throne not with Henry's calm, but with fire and fury, fueled by betrayal, vengeance, and a civil war that never really ended. 19. Edward IV. If kingship were a tournament, Edward IV would have been the champion the crowd cheered for. Tall, handsome, brutal in battle, and skilled at courtly charm. But the crowd rarely gets to see what happens after the banners fall and the blood dries. Beneath Edward's gilded surface lay a king who ruled like a warlord in silk, swift to reward loyalty, quicker to punish betrayal, and perfectly comfortable executing both family and friends if it meant securing his grip on power. He came to the throne in 1461 during the bladed nightmare of the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic civil war that pitted the houses of York and Lancaster against each other in a generational feud. Edward was only 19 when he led the Yorkist cause to victory at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles in English history. The Lancastrians were crushed, and the young Edward, towering, charismatic, and undefeated, was proclaimed king. But while he wore the crown, the war didn't end. It simply changed shape. Edward was a warrior king at heart, but he also understood the theatre of monarchy. He paraded his victory with confidence, rewarding allies, hosting tournaments, and dressing the part of a monarch who had tamed chaos. But behind the pageantry was a cold strategist. His approach to loyalty was transactional. Serve him well, and you were richly rewarded. Cross him once, and you'd find yourself stripped of titles, or worse. His greatest early ally was Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. It was Warwick's military genius and political influence that had helped place Edward on the throne. But Warwick quickly discovered that Edward was not a puppet. When Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow, it wasn't just a romantic scandal, it was a political earthquake. The Woodvilles were seen as social climbers. Edward's marriage bypassed all traditional alliances and upended Warwick's carefully laid plans for a diplomatic match with a foreign princess. Even worse, Edward lavished titles and lands on the Woodville family, alienating much of the old nobility. The fallout was immediate. Warwick turned against Edward, joining forces with Edward's own treacherous brother George, Duke of Clarence, who harboured his own delusions of kingship. In 1470, they managed to temporarily restore the mad Lancastrian King Henry VI to the throne in a shocking reversal. Edward fled to the continent. But Edward didn't stay gone for long. In 1471, he returned with a mercenary army, and the kind of confidence only desperation can buy. He defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Barnet, where Warwick was killed. He crushed them again at Tewkesbury, where Henry VI's only son, Edward of Westminster, died in battle. Shortly after, Henry VI himself died in the Tower of London, officially from grief, unofficially from something far less poetic. With the Lancastrian line broken, Edward resumed his reign, now blood-soaked and unchallenged. He had proven he could win a war. Now he intended to enjoy the peace. The second half of Edward's reign was less about conquest and more about consolidation, but also indulgence. He kept a lavish court, lived extravagantly, and maintained a delicate balance between charm and menace. He rewarded his allies, rebuilt royal authority, and made England relatively stable for a while. But he never lost his taste for ruthless efficiency. When his brother Clarence began plotting again, Edward had him arrested and tried for treason. The execution that followed was one of the strangest in English history, supposedly carried out by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine. Whether true or not, the story stuck, and the message was clear. Not even blood could buy immunity. Edward's death in 1483 was sudden and suspiciously ill-timed. He was only 40. He left behind two young sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, and a kingdom that had no idea how fragile peace could be until it shattered again, because those two sons would soon vanish into the walls of the Tower, and the man who took their place, Richard III, would go down in history not just as a king, but as a question: how far would someone go to secure the throne? The answer, in Richard's case, might have been all the way. 20. George III. To most modern minds, George III is shorthand for a mad king, a figure of pity caricatured in American school books and Broadway musicals as the powdered tyrant who lost the colonies and his mind. But beneath the theatrical portrait lies a ruler whose reign was not defined by mental illness alone, but by resistance to change, political repression, and a refusal to let go of power, even as the world shifted violently beneath his feet. He ruled longer than nearly any monarch before him, ascending the throne in 1760 and staying there until his death in 1820. That's 60 years of empire, war, revolution, and industrial upheaval, a reign so vast in time that it contained multiple worlds. And through it all, George tried, and often failed, to hold the kingdom together with moralistic stubbornness and a deeply held belief in royal authority. At first, he seemed different from his predecessors. He was the first Hanoverian king born and raised in England, spoke fluent English, and actually cared about governing. He read extensively, maintained a structured daily routine, and prided himself on personal virtue. He didn't gamble, didn't keep mistresses, and promoted himself as a family man, a moral anchor for a morally confused age. But behind that polished image was a king obsessed with control, one who micromanaged politics and expected deference from ministers who increasingly thought the crown should stay out of Parliament's way. His belief in duty was genuine but rigid. He didn't understand compromise, and as a result, he treated opposition as insubordination, not negotiation. This was never more obvious than in his handling of the American colonies. To George, the issue wasn't tea or taxes, it was defiance. When American leaders began resisting parliamentary authority, George saw it as an attack on royal dignity. He wasn't moved by their arguments about representation or constitutional rights. He believed that the colonies owed their allegiance to the crown, full stop. His response was not reform, but repression. More troops, more laws, more force. The result was revolution. He didn't lose the colonies overnight, but his refusal to bend gave rise to a war that Britain couldn't win, not just because of distance or logistics, but because the cause of independence became stronger than the empire's grip. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Britain's global reputation had taken a brutal hit, and George's popularity at home wavered, but he refused to step back. Instead, he redirected his energy toward domestic control. As revolutionary ideals spread across Europe, igniting the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon, George clamped down on dissent at home. His government passed laws restricting public gatherings, censoring radical newspapers, and arresting political activists. While France burned with the idea of liberty, England simmered under surveillance. To his credit, George remained deeply involved in British governance. He took his role seriously, too seriously. He demanded loyalty from ministers, interfered with legislation, and obstructed reformers. Even as the Industrial Revolution reshaped the economy and society, George remained tied to a worldview where monarchy was the fixed point around which everything else should revolve. Then came the madness. In the 1780s and again in the 1810s, George suffered from recurring bouts of what was likely porphyria, though other theories abound. During these episodes, he became incoherent, delusional, and eventually incapacitated. His condition forced Parliament to establish a regency in 1811, with his son, the future George IV, taking over as acting monarch. But George III never formally abdicated. He lived out the last decade of his life blind, deaf, and mentally detached, a shadow of the man who had once ruled half the known world. He died in 1820, having lost America, his sanity, and his place in the hearts of many of his subjects. And yet, his legacy remains contradictory. He's remembered in the US as the villain of revolution and in Britain as the king who stood firm against France. But his firmness often meant oppression. His refusal to adapt became a lesson in how monarchy could become a straitjacket, choking a nation as it struggled to breathe in new ideas. And his heir, George IV, would inherit the throne not with duty, but with decadence. Where George III tried to control, George IV would simply indulge, and England, once again, would find that there are many ways for a king to fail, some loud, others luxurious. 21. George IV. If George III was a monarch who erred on the side of obsession, his son George IV veered off the road entirely. He didn't just drift from his father's sense of responsibility, he slammed the door on it, tossed the key into a champagne bottle, and hosted a masquerade ball in its honour. To call him England's most decadent monarch is to undersell the situation. George IV didn't merely indulge, he constructed his identity around the act of consumption: food, clothes, attention, flattery, and most of all, power with none of the responsibility. He officially became king in 1820, but he had already been Prince Regent since 1811 due to his father's mental illness. For 9 years before wearing the crown, George enjoyed all the luxuries of kingship without any of the pressure to perform. And when he finally did inherit the throne, he treated it less as a position of leadership and more as an extension of his private estate. Where his father had presented himself as a moral example, perhaps to a fault, George IV was a walking contradiction: vain, petty, extravagant, and deeply insecure. He surrounded himself with sycophants, detested criticism, and spent much of his reign buried under a mountain of personal debt, much of it accumulated from a lifestyle that would embarrass even the most hedonistic of French courtiers. He was obsessed with image, not reputation, but aesthetic. He micromanaged portraits of himself, demanding idealized versions that shaved pounds and decades off his real appearance. His wardrobe reportedly included over 10,000 articles of clothing, many of them custom-designed, gold-threaded, or so ornate they couldn't be worn twice without causing comment. His residences, especially the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, were exercises in architectural egotism. Exotic domes, lavish interiors, and decor so excessive it looked less like a royal palace and more like a museum of delusions. But beneath the glitter was a deeply dysfunctional king. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a public disaster. Arranged for political convenience, it was loathed by both parties from day one. George reportedly demanded brandy to get through the wedding night. Caroline returned the favour with open contempt. After the birth of their daughter, Princess Charlotte, the two effectively separated, but the scandal didn't stop there. When George became king, he tried to bar Caroline from his coronation and even attempted to divorce her by accusing her of adultery in a trial conducted in the House of Lords. The trial was a national spectacle. Public opinion turned violently against George, painting him not as a betrayed husband, but as a vindictive hypocrite. Protesters flooded the streets. Pamphlets mocked him. When Caroline died shortly after being denied entry to the coronation, many blamed him outright. But George IV didn't just fail in his personal life. His political role was one of apathy veiled as caution. While his ministers, particularly Lord Liverpool, governed through a period of significant unrest and economic strain, George remained largely uninvolved, emerging only to oppose reform or promote vanity projects. His resistance to Catholic emancipation, despite earlier promises of neutrality, delayed progress and fractured his own government. His reign coincided with growing demands for change, expanding suffrage, labour rights, religious tolerance. George had no appetite for any of it. His vision of monarchy was static, ceremonial, and fundamentally about himself. He grew more isolated as the years passed. His health deteriorated rapidly due to obesity, gout, and a lifestyle that would have incapacitated lesser men decades earlier. He became reclusive, addicted to laudanum and food, and prone to erratic moods and paranoid episodes. By the time of his death in 1830, he had become a bloated relic of an era that no longer existed. His legacy was largely one of embarrassment. He was mocked during his life and forgotten soon after. Even his funeral procession was heckled. No monument, no war, no great law bears his name. His greatest contributions to the monarchy were accidental. He demonstrated with staggering clarity the dangers of unchecked indulgence and the public consequences of royal selfishness. And yet, for all his vanity and vices, George IV did leave something behind, a warning carved in ivory and silk, because not all evil is violent. Sometimes it's wasteful, sometimes it's indifferent. Sometimes it rules not by fear, but by feeding itself while the country starves for dignity. The next king on our list, Ethelred the Unready, ruled with neither splendour nor strategy. He didn't waste a kingdom on clothes or parties. He simply failed to lead it at all. And when the Vikings came knocking, England found out just how unready their king truly was. 22. Ethelred the Unready. Some kings destroy nations with cruelty. Others do it with arrogance. Ethelred the Unready managed it with confusion. His reign, which stretched from 978 to 1016, was not one of evil in the theatrical sense. There were no elaborate executions, no palace purges, no paranoid crackdowns. Instead, it was a slow collapse into failure, punctuated by fear, panic, and one stunning act of mass violence that sealed his place in the darker corners of English history. He became king at the age of around 10, following the suspicious death of his half-brother Edward the Martyr, a teenage king who had ruled for just 3 years before being murdered while visiting his stepmother. Whether Ethelred, or more accurately his advisors, had anything to do with the killing remains uncertain. What is certain is that Ethelred's rule began in blood and suspicion and never really escaped the shadow. The nickname Unready is a mistranslation. The original Old English, unrad, meant poor counsel or badly advised. The irony is sharp. Ethelred literally means noble counsel, so the name Ethelred Unread is less a title and more a tragic pun. Noble counsel, no counsel. And that about sums it up. Ethelred's greatest failure wasn't a single decision. It was his pattern of indecision. He ruled in a time of rising danger, with Viking raids escalating into full-blown invasions. England had faced Viking threats before, but under Ethelred, the response turned from disorganized to catastrophic. Every raid was met with panic. Every invasion was countered with indecision, and often a bribe. The solution favoured by Ethelred and his court was the payment of Danegeld, tribute paid to Viking raiders to make them go away. The sums were enormous, draining the royal treasury and humiliating the crown. But the bribes didn't work for long. Each payment invited more attacks and more ambitious demands. Viking leaders realised that England under Ethelred was a kingdom that would pay to be left alone. But even the Danegeld would pale in comparison to St. Brice's day. In the year 1002, Ethelred issued a chilling royal order. All Danes living in England, or at least those seen as potential threats, were to be killed. The logic, such as it was, stemmed from the belief that Danish settlers might rise up and support Viking invaders. Rather than deal with loyalty through diplomacy, Ethelred chose extermination. The massacre was carried out on St. Brice's Day, November 13th. While exact numbers are unknown, the slaughter is remembered as one of the most morally jarring acts of early English monarchy. Among the dead was Gunhilda, the sister of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard. Her death was personal. The retaliation was inevitable. Sweyn responded with a vengeance, launching a massive invasion that overran large parts of England. Ethelred fled. He returned only after Sweyn's sudden death in 1014, but by then his authority had all but disintegrated. His kingdom had been burned, his people disillusioned, and his legacy irrevocably stained. It wasn't that Ethelred never tried. He enacted laws, he called councils, he built churches, but every action seemed too little, too late, or utterly misplaced. His rule was reactive, not strategic. He blamed his failures on divine punishment, not poor policy. He alienated nobles, punished allies, and mistrusted advice. He was, in many ways, a man drowning in the weight of kingship, trying to solve the crisis of leadership with spiritual guilt and short-term deals. When he died in 1016, England was already in the hands of a new conqueror, Canute the Great, a Danish king who succeeded where Ethelred had failed. Ethelred left behind no triumphant legacy, no great reform, no victory, just a nickname that mocked him for the very thing he lacked: readiness. His was a reign that proved a king doesn't have to be cruel to cause chaos. Neglect, indecision, and panic are their own forms of harm, and when tied to the crown, they can unravel nations just as efficiently as swords and fire. But some monarchs didn't fail through absence or passivity. They ruled with purpose and greed, every action sharpened to extract power and wealth. William Rufus, Ethelred's successor in notoriety, didn't care about virtue or legacy. He just wanted control, and he'd take it from anyone at any cost. 23. William Rufus. If kings were measured by charisma, William II, known as William Rufus, wouldn't place in the top 10. If they were judged by fear, manipulation, or sheer contempt for constraint, however, he'd be in strong contention. Son of William the Conqueror, brother to Henry I, and a king who wore the crown like a loaded weapon, William Rufus ruled England from 1087 to 1100 with a brutal sense of entitlement and a deep distrust of nearly everyone around him. His nickname, Rufus, likely referred to his ruddy complexion or red hair, but it might as well have described his temperament: hot-blooded, quick to anger, and dangerous when cornered. While his father carved England into submission with calculated violence, William Rufus ruled like a man who had inherited a kingdom he neither respected nor particularly liked. He was not the heir William the Conqueror intended for England. Upon his death in 1087, the conqueror split his territories. Normandy went to his eldest son, Robert Curthose, and England, the richer, more volatile prize, went to William Rufus. This division wasn't just a family squabble waiting to happen, it was a recipe for fratricide in slow motion. William inherited a kingdom still reeling from conquest. A patchwork of resentful Anglo-Saxon subjects, opportunistic Norman nobles, and a church that had grown dangerously self-assured. He approached all three with the same general strategy: exploit, intimidate, and, when necessary, crush. His relationship with the church was particularly antagonistic. When Archbishop Lanfranc, the moderate, respected head of the English church, died in 1089, William deliberately left the position vacant for years, not because he couldn't find a suitable candidate, but because, as long as there was no archbishop, the revenues from church lands flowed directly into the royal treasury. It was theft disguised as procrastination, and it made William rich. When he finally appointed a replacement, it was Anselm of Bec, a respected theologian and future saint. William expected obedience. What he got was a man with a spine. Anselm resisted royal interference in church affairs, insisted on moral reform, and clashed repeatedly with the king over spiritual authority. William responded with threats, delays, and calculated humiliation. Their battles would foreshadow the broader conflicts between church and crown that would define the next century. But William's style of rule was about more than ecclesiastical bullying. He bled the kingdom dry with taxes so high that they bordered on economic assault. Nobles and commoners alike paid dearly for the king's luxuries, military campaigns, and endless castle-building schemes. His court was infamous for its corruption, and his officials, many of whom had risen not through nobility but through royal favour, enforced the king's will with ruthless efficiency. He was also a military opportunist, fighting repeated campaigns to assert dominance in Wales, suppress rebellions from his own barons, and support or betray his brother Robert, depending on the week. His rule was defined by constant suspicion. He trusted no one, and no one truly trusted him. And then, suddenly, it ended. In 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, William was shot by an arrow and died almost instantly. The official account calls it an accident, a stray shot by one of his companions, Walter Tyrrell. But the circumstances have puzzled historians for centuries. There was no inquiry, no effort to investigate, and most tellingly, his brother Henry, who was conveniently present, wasted no time seizing the royal treasury and claiming the throne. It was one of the smoothest successions in medieval history, far too smooth for comfort. Whether murdered or simply unlucky, William Rufus left behind no wife, no children, and no popular mourning. His body was buried hastily in Winchester Cathedral, reportedly splitting the stone when it was dropped into the tomb, a final insult for a king who had spent his life demanding control over a country that never gave him its heart. He is remembered as a blasphemous, greedy, and morally ambiguous figure, not evil in the theatrical sense, but dangerous in the way of men who hold too much power and believe too little in anything but themselves. And while William's story ends in a forest with an arrow, the next king, Edward VI, would rule not with violence or extravagance, but through something far colder, religious transformation handled by others in his name. Because when kings are children, their sins are often committed by adults with agendas, and Edward VI, though young, presided over a reign of fire in the name of reform. 24. Edward VI. If Edward VI had lived long enough, he might have become a king of reform vision or ruthless consolidation. But history never gave him the chance. Instead, he reigned as a boy surrounded by ambitious adults, men who spoke of godly transformation but acted with political precision. His was a rule of sermons and statutes, of burnings and bannings, all carried out in his name, while he sat on the throne like a symbol, clean, polished, and increasingly irrelevant to the mechanisms behind him. Born in 1537, Edward was the long-awaited son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, the only male heir Henry managed to keep alive. That alone gave him mythic significance. He was England's Protestant hope, the Tudor dynasty's insurance policy, and a living validation of Henry's long, bloody matrimonial history. When Edward ascended the throne in 1547 at the age of 9, he was hailed as a miracle and immediately became a puppet. The real rulers were the men who surrounded him. First, his maternal uncle Edward Seymour, who styled himself Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who seized power through court intrigue and cold mathematics. These men didn't merely advise the king, they governed through him, using Edward's authority to wage an aggressive Protestant revolution across England. What followed was a spiritual purge disguised as reformation. Somerset and his circle launched a series of religious reforms designed to erase the remnants of Catholicism and reshape the national faith in a distinctly Protestant mould. Churches were stripped of altars, icons, relics, and paintings. Latin liturgies were replaced with English prayers. The Book of Common Prayer, written by Thomas Cranmer, became the standard for worship, uniform, state-controlled, and deeply controversial. To the reformers, this was purification. To much of the population, especially in the countryside, it was cultural erasure. The result was widespread unrest. In 1549, the Prayer Book Rebellion broke out in Devon and Cornwall, where traditionalist forces rallied against the sudden imposition of Protestantism. They weren't rebelling against Edward personally. They were resisting the men behind the curtain and the religion that had replaced their world overnight. The government responded with brutal efficiency. Thousands were killed in the suppression of the uprising. Martial law was declared. Somerset's regime, already unpopular due to poor economic decisions and rising inflation, began to crumble. He was arrested, briefly released, and then executed, not for heresy, but for political miscalculation. Enter John Dudley, a man less idealistic than Somerset and far more dangerous. Dudley understood that real power came from controlling access to the monarch, and Edward, now in his early teens, was beginning to believe in his own divine authority. The boy king absorbed Protestant doctrine like oxygen. He saw himself as the head of a godly kingdom, destined to complete his father's religious revolution. Under Dudley, the Crown's policies grew even sharper. Catholic clergy were imprisoned or exiled. Church lands continued to be redistributed. The Mass was banned entirely, and while Edward never personally ordered executions, heretics were burned, priests imprisoned, and doctrinal resistance criminalized, all under the stamp of a king who hadn't yet reached his 15th birthday. But Edward's reign wasn't built to last. By 1553, he was seriously ill, likely with tuberculosis. The question of succession loomed large. Edward, deeply committed to the Protestant cause, was determined to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from taking the throne. Together with Dudley, he drafted a devise for the succession, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey, a teenage noblewoman with royal blood and the right religion. It was a final, desperate attempt to secure the Protestant legacy. It failed spectacularly. Edward died at just 15 years old. Jane was queen for 9 days before Mary rode into London with the full weight of public support and ended the experiment. Jane was imprisoned and eventually executed. Dudley met the axe soon after. The Protestant reforms of Edward's reign were overturned within months, and yet Edward's rule left a mark. He was the first English monarch raised entirely in the Protestant faith, and under him, England became something it had never fully been before, a Protestant state by law and by force. The religious wars that followed weren't accidents. They were the consequence of a child king's fragile dream enforced by dangerous men, and when Mary I came to power, she didn't see Edward's reforms as policy. She saw them as heresy, and she would answer with fire. But centuries earlier, a different king had responded to heresy not with ideology, but with ambition, cloaking empire in theology. Oliver Cromwell, though never crowned, would rule as if God had handed him a sword, and he would use it to punish 3 kingdoms in the name of moral purity. 25. Oliver Cromwell, he never wore a crown, but Oliver Cromwell ruled with a weight that bent the English monarchy without ever sitting on its throne. A farmer's son turned soldier, a Puritan turned political architect, Cromwell was the man who stepped into the void left by a decapitated king and decided that a republic still needed one figure at the top. It just didn't have to be called a king. By the time Cromwell took power as Lord Protector in 1653, England had been torn apart by years of civil war, revolution, and regicide. Charles I was dead, executed by his own people. The monarchy was abolished. Parliament was reduced to a skeleton of factions and failed experiments. The country had traded a crown for a vacuum, and Cromwell predictably filled it. He presented himself as a reluctant ruler, a man called by duty rather than ambition, but his rule was anything but passive. From the moment he assumed the title of Lord Protector, Cromwell governed as a military strongman cloaked in scripture, issuing decrees, dismissing parliaments, and ruling not by consensus but by conviction. His power was based on fear and faith. He believed, truly, that England had been chosen by God to lead a new moral order. The monarchy had been corrupt. The church had been indulgent. The people had been blind. It was now his task to remake the country in the image of divine righteousness. And for Cromwell, righteousness was enforced with discipline. Under his rule, public morality became law. Theatres were closed, gambling banned, Christmas celebrations suppressed. The culture of England was strangled by a version of Puritanism that saw joy as a distraction and pleasure as a sin. Local officials, often called moral governors, were appointed to inspect behaviour, regulate conduct, and impose order on communities that had once been defined by variety and custom. These were not simply policies, they were attempts to shape the soul of the nation. But Cromwell's most infamous legacy lies outside England, in a place where his name still evokes bitterness: Ireland. In 1649, Cromwell launched a military campaign to subdue Ireland and suppress Catholic royalist forces. What followed were sieges that became symbols of brutality. Drogheda and Wexford, towns taken with overwhelming force, and followed by the mass killing of defenders and civilians alike. Cromwell justified these actions as acts of war, divine justice against rebellion. His soldiers called it necessary. History has called it something else, an atrocity cloaked in sanctity. The Irish campaign wasn't an aberration. It was Cromwell's worldview turned into strategy. He believed that rebellion was not political, but spiritual, that those who resisted England's divine mission were not just enemies, but sinners, and sinners, in Cromwell's mind, could be punished without guilt. Back in England, Cromwell oversaw a regime that grew increasingly authoritarian. Though he claimed to protect Parliament, he dissolved it more than once when it failed to follow his will. He surrounded himself with a council of officers, leaned on military rule, and made use of intelligence networks that monitored dissent. Despite this, he was never universally feared or admired. He was cheered by radicals who saw him as the death of monarchy, but distrusted by Republicans who feared he was becoming one in all but name. He declined the actual crown when it was offered in 1657, possibly out of religious principle, possibly out of fear of backlash. But the ceremony of kingship remained. He was styled His Highness. He rode in procession. He lived in palaces. The Lord Protector was not so different from the kings he had helped destroy, only hungrier for virtue and more certain of his cause. When he died in 1658, the experiment collapsed. His son Richard Cromwell briefly succeeded him, but lacked the charisma, discipline, or ideological fire to hold the centre. Within 2 years, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, and the nation collectively exhaled. Cromwell's body, once buried with honours in Westminster Abbey, was dug up, posthumously tried, and symbolically executed. His head was mounted on a pike. The monarchy had returned, and England was eager to erase the man who had unseated it. But erasure isn't the same as forgetting. Cromwell remains one of the most divisive figures in British history. Hailed as a defender of liberty, condemned as a military dictator, remembered as a zealot with a vision and a sword. He ruled without a crown, but made the monarchy's absence feel like a presence. The silence between thrones where ideology ruled louder than blood. And so our journey ends not with a king or queen, but with a man who proved that power, when dressed in righteousness, can be just as cruel as any royal decree. Because in the end, whether crowned or self-appointed, evil in a throne room always finds a chair.